Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Classical Christian Academy. Thank you for coming this evening. If you will make your way towards the seats, and we have plenty up front at the moment, but you're going to have to get to them quickly before they're all snatched up by the top performing students. Thank you for coming this evening. As you get settled, if we need more chairs, we'll be happy to put them out, but I think we've got a few, and you're going to want to be up as close to Mr. Goodwin as possible. He's that wonderful. Well, once again, thank you for coming this evening. My name is Bill Stutzman. I'm the headmaster here at Classical Christian Academy, and we're really thankful for this opportunity that we have this evening to hear from the president of the Association for Classical Christian Schools, the ACCS, Mr. David Goodwin. Before we do that, I want to give you a little bit of an outline of the evening and tell you a little bit of what you're in for. Mr. Goodwin and I go back many years, and so it's a real treat to have him here. And as many of you know, this was rescheduled from our time in November to accommodate his arrival, and so we're very, very thankful that we could make that work. So thanks for coming out on a somewhat drizzly January evening. If you'll join me, let's begin with a word of prayer, and we'll get started. Our Father in heaven, Almighty God, we thank you for the glories that you present, for revealing yourself through your word, and for sending your Son to live and to die and to be raised to new life, all on our behalf, to pay for our sins, to give us meaning and to give us relationship with you. We thank you for your mercies, and we thank you for good things to learn. We're grateful for the fellowship that we get to enjoy across many miles and many years, and we are thankful to be a part of your work in the world through history. Lord, we're grateful for this time that you have allowed us to set aside this evening, and thankful that we can have Mr. Goodwin with us. We ask that you would be with us in our thinking and in our questioning, in our considerations, that we would take every thought captive to Christ, and that we would grow for better equipped service for you. We thank you that you have been so gracious to attach your name to us, and we pray that we would do you honor this evening. In Jesus' name, amen. Well, before we get Mr. Goodwin up, we have a couple quick announcements as you are all getting settled. The format of the evening tonight is going to begin with a streaming of the first episode of what became a Fox Nation docuseries, and one of the most watched docuseries on Fox Nation in the past year, that began as a research project and then a book that Mr. Goodwin was working on about the deeper and longer history of education, and particularly the influence of the progressives in that education. And he'll tell you more about that story. But we're going to have the opportunity to watch episode 1, which is just under a half hour. There are 5 episodes total in the first season, and there will be, yes, a second season, I've just learned, which is really exciting. Then we'll hear a few words from Mr. Goodwin about the book and about the documentary. It became a book, which you see here, Battle for the American Mind. And he'll talk a little bit about the relationship between the documentary and the book and his experience. And then I'll have a chance to sit down with him and do some interview back and forth. And then you'll have a chance as an audience also to ask David some questions. But before we get started on that, I wanted to invite our development director, Mrs. Shannon Mayfield, up. She's got some exciting news to share about our recent year-end campaign.
Thank you. I know some of you are not directly connected to CCA, so I hope that you can just celebrate with us. But for those of you who are, you know that we had 2 matches at the end of the year. So God graciously provided us with a match from Thrivent for the trees that we had planted outside, and that totaled $10,000. And then we also had a match for $25,000 for the year-end giving drive. And I am excited to announce that we not only hit them both, but we exceeded our goal, and our year-end drive total was $88,414.83, which is the most that CCA has ever raised at the end of the year. So thank you so much to everybody who contributed that, whether financially or sharing the links or prayerfully just covering that. So give yourselves and the Lord a hand. Thank you.
All right. David, do you want to say any words before we roll this? Or do we just roll? Are you ready to roll? We're going to roll it. What you're about to witness is episode 1 of The Miseducation of America, hosted by Pete Hegseth of Fox Nation, featuring ACCS President David Goodwin. Enjoy. Some memorable lines in that video, and we are thankful to be among the folks here in the community who have been pursuing classical Christian education for some time. And before I welcome David up, who's the president of the Association for Classical Christian Schools, I want to acknowledge that we've got the blessing here in this area of having 3 member schools of the Association of Classical Christian Schools, and all 3 are represented here tonight. So welcome to folks from the Oaks and Charlie Dowers, headmaster there. Thanks for coming. And several of our brothers and sisters from the Oaks. And also Spokane Classical Christian School. And I saw Brent earlier. Where are you, Brent? Brent Harkin down here, headmaster there. So thank you all for coming and welcome. Our brothers and sisters doing the same things, part of the same association. We're grateful that you would join us tonight. It is interesting, isn't it? We're going on 30 years here just at Classical Christian Academy, similar with the Oaks, and other schools in this movement have been pursuing this for some time. And here we are in the early 2020s, and it's even caught Fox's attention. How did that happen? And is it a good thing? That's an interesting question as well. Well, David Goodwin has been researching the history of education for as long as I have known him. I was privileged to be able to work with David for 10 years at the Ambrose School. He taught me much of what I know about education and classical Christian education. I owe him a deep grat of gratitude. Maybe I owe him even more now, actually. David is a fellow Idahoan. He was raised on a farm in southern Idaho in Napoleon Dynamite territory, if that means anything to you. I didn't tell him I'd mentioned that, but ask him about the lockers sometime. But he went on to earn an MBA and became a part of a Fortune 500 tech company, traveled the world pretty extensively, gave all that up to pursue the crazy idea of starting a classical Christian school before he even had kids who were of school age, and that was Foundations Academy that became the Ambrose School. He was a founding board member of that school and was the headmaster there for 13 years. And he's currently, as I said, president of the Association of Classical Christian Schools, which has going on 400 member schools. They're 300 plus, and we are one of 50-some that are accredited here. And he has, if you've seen the Discover booklet, Discover Classical Christian Education, there are more than 100,000 copies of that circulating around. If you applied to our school, you probably got that in a packet or at other schools. He's the author of that and is now traveling all over the country talking about the miseducation of America, the battle for the American mind. He also is the editor of the Classical Difference magazine, if you get that in the mail periodically. He is the author of that. He is featured in numerous articles and now gets to speak nationally. We're very thankful that he would join us here. He teamed up with Pete Hegseth, who hosted that last bit on Fox, and he'll tell you a little bit about that and how we got to the battle for the American mind. He and his wife Stormy still live in Boise, and they have 3 kids who have been classically educated. He's a good family friend, and we are privileged to have him here tonight, so please join me in giving a warm welcome to Mr. David Goodwin.
That's funny to hear Bill talk about it as though I taught him things. The real story there is that when I arrived at the school, I knew nothing about classical education. Bill was already there, and he was quickly moved into my right-hand man position because he taught me most of what I know. And I don't say that humbly. I think it's true. So Bill, obviously, I think he's even listed in the acknowledgments of the book. So you are blessed to have him for those who are here at CCA. So I just wanted to talk, I'm going to make a few brief comments and about the project and about what we've been doing, and then we'll go into a Q&A session. One of the questions that most people want to know is how in the world this came about. Fox is not normally, interested in curio niche kinds of education, and we've had quite a run with this series. So back, it was in the March of 2020 when this whole thing started. So if you know that time period, of course, COVID was still sort of just emerging onto the scene. We really had no idea where that was going to go, or even we really didn't give it much thought. And so I got a call in my office. Obviously, when you have an association name like the Association of Classical Christian Schools, you get the calls from the press. I regularly do from places like New York Times and even small press. Charisma Magazine called me the other day. So it's not unusual for us to get those calls. But what was unusual was a call from Pete, because I didn't know him. I didn't know of him. Sadly, it was one of those situations. I keep having this. I wasn't a Fox viewer very much, and so I found myself hemming and hawing at several points along the way as to who he was introducing me to, because they were well-known people that I didn't know. But he was doing a diner. He kind of does man-on-the-street things for the morning show, and he was doing a diner interview in North Carolina. And a woman had two very well-behaved girls in uniforms with her, and he asked, where they went to school, and she said, if you haven't heard of classical Christian education, you need to call the association. He did, and when I picked up the phone, he said, hey, I'm with Fox, and we're interested in what you're doing. Can you tell us a little bit about classical education? So I gave him my elevator speech that lasts you'd have to have a pretty tall building, I think. And so he said, well, we're looking to, do some stuff with education, particularly patriotic education, things that really train young American patriots. And is that how you would describe this? And I said, no, actually, every founding father of this country was educated classically, but it was not a patriotic, that wasn't its purpose, that wasn't its focus. And so he was kind of hemming and hawing a little bit, and I said, actually, it's a Christian paideia that sustains any government, any institution. Over time, it needs the elements of Christian paideia, and of course, paideia was a new word to him. The conversation went on a little while, and I've found over the years that reporters give you about 20 minutes, and then they need to move on to the next thing. So instead of hitting the barrier, I sent him 2 chapters of a book that Bill knows I've been working on for a long time. I think I was working on it at the time he was working with me back many years ago. So I sent them, and I got a call back in a couple of weeks, and he said, you're blowing my mind, kind of like he did in the thing. What is this? The Pledge of Allegiance was invented by a socialist. And so that story is episode 2, along with several other aspects of progressive education. Episode 3, 4, and 5 all were part of what I wrote in the context of this. So when Pete got the story, he said, we've got to tell this story. Let's see what I can do. He managed to work it into the Fox Nation, which is their streaming service documentary series, because the Fox News doesn't really do documentaries, although this documentary did air on Fox News at various points. Pieces of it did. And so when we did the documentary, it was kind of done, Pete's got some sway at Fox. It was kind of done as a favor, and Fox Nation needed content. It became, so they released it with during that time period, by the providence of God, from March of 2020 until it released in 2021, actually 2022, I think, it had grown in what had happened is, you guys probably remember the whole situation in Virginia with Governor Lunkin, I think it was, that happened, and Fox now needed educational content. So they thrust this front and center and put a big show on in Virginia down in last year, down in Richmond. And we walked in, and it was like the set was massive. I was kind of surprised. You can find it on the same Fox Nation thing. So they did this big thing on it, and it became the most binge-watched show on Fox. And at the same time, I had been trying to get the book put out because, in fact, you can probably tell from just the tone of the documentary, it's very Fox-like. It has drama and controversy, and, it's like flags burning and all kinds of stuff. That's Fox. The book it was our opportunity to tell the story in a much more metered, and it's got some of that in it because Pete writes the first 2 chapters, and the last 2 chapters, that was part of the agreement with Harper to get, his viewpoint solidly put in there. And I think they're good chapters. But I think you'd find a lot more in the book, and that's why we wanted to get it out. I had written it, couldn't get it published. Long and short is he helped me get it published, but it had to have his name on it. That wasn't his requirement. He really wanted to stay out of it, but it was the publisher's requirement. So that's how Pete is involved in this. And the thing is, he's not he has degrees from Princeton and Harvard. He's a pretty sharp guy, and he was picking it up and able to articulate it better than I could. So it's how God seems to use this whole process, was putting people in places where their talents were brought to the front. He can really articulate it. We've been speaking all over the country, and he does such a good job now with it. But it was a story that kind of took the both of us to develop. Now Fox is in the process. So I filmed. They asked me to work with them on season 2. So season 2 was filmed a few months ago. It has Governor DeSantis and a bunch of other conservatives from around the country in it. And we're doing, 2 weeks from tonight, I'll be at another one of these launch live events on Fox Nation doing the launch of season 2. And so, frankly, I can't commend it to you because I have never seen it and I don't know what the script is. I was interviewed for it. This one I wrote the script for the most part. I mean, the Fox producers did a lot of the snazzy stuff, but the basics of it were mine and Pete's. So I guess what I would say is the reason Fox grabbed hold of this thing is because they realized for the first time they were dealing with an educational answer that was bigger than the problem. Because the answer was not about training little kids to be patriots. The answer was about freedom itself. It was about Christ and about the necessity of a Christian nation with Christian children being educated in a Christian way. The book is very much more Christian even than the series is, because the point is, without the Western, what we call the Western Christian paideia, or the cultivation, is Ephesians 6 and Deuteronomy 6 say, the raising of children in the fear and admonition of the Lord, which is a translation of the term raise your children in the paideia of the Lord. Without that, we really can't function as a society or as a civilization. And that's what Fox liked. And I think that's the part that brought me into this from my background that Bill highlighted for you, was when I realized that I wasn't trying to build a school for my kids, although all of my kids have gone through classical Christian school. The oldest of them, it took extremely well. My daughter just graduated from New St. Andrews last year, and she's teaching in classical schools. They all, are lovers of it. My youngest is still working at loving it, but I'm sure he'll get there. He's 16, so I don't have much time left, but we'll see. The reason I was doing this from the beginning, and the reason that Pete jumped on board, Pete ended up, here's the conclusion of the story. So he lived in New York, of course. He uprooted his family and moved it to Nashville, Tennessee, to a classical Christian school there. And he is, flying back and forth to New York. And so that's how important it was to him. And then last week I was at a school that kind of transposes your name a little bit. It's Christ Classical. So it's another CCA, but it's, Christ Classical in Tallahassee, Florida. And when I got on campus and we started working, I got to meet DeSantis' son, who is all his kids are there. And so this school is a small school. It's much smaller than this school, much smaller than any of the 3 schools that are here. And even so, he sees and recognizes it. He's in the next series, the next season, as I mentioned. So I think that I just wanted to commend that to you, that really the reason we found success with this was the providence of God and the fact that it's a big story. And that it's much more important. If you have kids here, you probably don't yet even know how important the paideia that they're picking up is. If you are a contributor or you just are here out of curiosity, please look into it. Since the book's been written, I have taken calls from all over the country, from all manner of people. People who I would never get the opportunity to talk to otherwise. Like I said, we were well received at the Reagan Library. They're hearing this story, and I think a lot of conservatives are hearing it for the first time. And of course, it's not necessarily a conservative story other than it's a Christian story. And the Christian piece of it often is appealing to conservatives. And so I'm thankful that the Lord is using this to expose a lot of conservatives that I talked to in the book signing lines haven't really put the fact that Christ being at the center of education is essential for our republic together until this book. So hopefully that it will continue to get used that way. And I'm hopeful. We've got, the book, again, by the providence of God, and then Pete's Connections ended up number 1 on the New York Times list for 4 weeks, and it stayed on the list for 14 weeks, something like that. So it got a lot of attention, and they've asked for another one, so I'm working on another one. This one will probably just be under my name. But anyway, I'm just praying that the Lord will continue to use the work of our member schools. Really, I do this for member schools just as a function of wanting to encourage and grow the association. Our association's grown from, 385 students 385 schools right around the center of COVID, and we're up to 465 right now. That's more growth than we ever have seen in that time period. About 100 a year. Those numbers include some that fail or drop away, so it doesn't add up. But we are growing at about 100 a year right now, and that's a blessing. We just need to find and pray for the resources to get out there and be able to do this for more kids in more places. I really would encourage you to watch the other 4, 5 episodes of this, and maybe if you have a Fox Nation subscription, you can watch the next series and see what you think of it. So, Bill, I think I'm ready for questions.
No, you're fine. Want to see how awkward I can make this? Okay. Thank you, David. It's amazing to see God's providence in faithfulness over time. Right? When you look at the way that you were researching this, you had questions, you had ideas, and it led you to pursue some answers in places that were a little bit unexpected. One of the books that you showed up there, or that was part of the video we were talking earlier, I remember you finding that book at a library and bringing it in, and it was, you might have said, one of their own was confessing to the plan all along. Can you tell us a little bit about the discovery process of, pause. We should define some terms, probably. Should we define some terms? There are a couple that are going to come up. You've heard Paideia, that was on there, and then progressive. So can you just talk a little bit about, first of all, these two big P words that are going to be an important part of this discussion?
Yeah, so I'll start with progressives. We've all heard of the progressives. If you went to public school like I did, you were probably told of in your American history course in the turn of the 20th century, guys like Woodrow Wilson and the heroes they were for ending child labor and solving a lot of unjust labor processes and that sort of thing. But they were really a formalized grouping. There was kind of an amalgamation of social gospelist Christians, so these are mainstream Christians, or mainline Christians, and guys like John Dewey, who were socialist, atheistic humanists, but they were both tied to wanting social justice, as they called it. And so that was the engine that kind of motivated the progressives, and it formulated their work even then in the 1900 to 1920 time frame. And so what we were told about them in school makes most of us think, well, they were the good guys. And so I didn't ever really consider looking into them until a lecture I attended with Hillsdale, and we'll get to that in a second. But the second question, we were defining Paideia. I punt on this one every time because, again, even Dubai can't build an elevator long enough that takes long enough for me to get through Paideia. But Paideia is essentially what the Greeks noticed. I'll just tell the story of its formation really quick. The Greeks noticed that when a conquering group would conquer another group, they'd enslave the women, enslave the men, and take the children. And sometimes those children would end up in the other families to be raised up to a certain point, or they were slaves, but they were kind of raised up in that civilization. And the funny thing was, a child from a different tribe would look just like the tribe they were absorbed into. So the Greeks were like postulating that there's something about the way they're raised that changes who they are from one tribe to another. It changes the very essence of what they think and what they feel and what their affections are. So their affections for a particular god or a particular way of worshiping or anything was really driven by this mysterious unknown feature that the Greeks wanted to define. They came up with a concept of Paideia, and then they said if it can be used by tyrants to shape the hearts of even outsiders, outside children, to love what that civilization loves, then we could engineer a Paideia, an education, that will shape the hearts and minds of children to love freedom and democracy. Now, this is, of course, in a pagan culture, so they really weren't trying to address the pagan or the gods aspect of it, but that was its genesis. And it continues from the Golden Age of Greece into the first century as a word, Paideia, and then God picks it up and puts it in Scripture in several places. The most famous of which I've already cited, the Ephesians 6, but there's several other places that are listed in the book. Because it's a real thing. It's the way in which the hearts and affections are shaped to love that which is true, good, and beautiful. That's essentially the definition. It's just so ethereal that most people can't pick it up. But every time you see, I guess this is the way I could describe it. Around the first century, the reason Ephesians 6, how's it start out? Fathers, don't provoke your children to anger, but raise them in the fear and admonition of the Lord. So what's this don't provoke your children to anger piece? Well, the Greek culture into which they were writing, anybody who had the means to do it would buy a slave or hire a academic tutor to go around and correct every step a child took that was out of line with the philosophy of the family. So the family might be a stoic family. And if a child didn't behave in a stoic way in a certain situation, their pedagogue, which was what they called these people, would whack them with a stick, quite literally. And so the process was one of beating out of the children anything that was errant and encouraging anything that was a good affection, even from very young ages. So what God's saying is, you don't need to provoke them to anger. Raise them to love the Lord in the fear and admonition of the Lord. So that's what paideia is. It's a very difficult construct to get next to. We translate the ways, I think I counted 7 or 8 different ways that it's translated into the New Testament because nobody knows how to translate it. So odd concept.
We get discipline, we get nurture, we get all kinds of raising up, enculturation, all these ideas.
Yeah.
So why would something so powerful and so promising be a target to take down?
Yeah, that's what I found out. So that takes us to the story directly. I just happened to attend a lecture by a professor because a friend of mine wanted me to. I really didn't. It was a providential thing in retrospect. And he cited a piece from the New Republic where the author was saying that the state has an interest in controlling what he called the plasticity of the child. And I thought that was a very odd word, plasticity. I knew the citation was from the early 1900s, so and I knew the language was different then, but I wanted to get the context of this little tiny quote. So I went to the library and figured I couldn't remember, I was in a big lecture crowd. I couldn't get up to him afterwards. So I just figured it's got to be in the library and it's got to be findable. And so I tried to find it in, I don't know. Yes.
So you actually had to look for it.
Exactly. Now when people ask me, I just Google it. But then, this was probably 2010, 2008, somewhere in there. Google was good then, but it wasn't that good. And they didn't index all of dusty old magazines from 1914. So I found it, and essentially, well, first off, what struck me was, I thought this is going to be easy because I can just skim the table of contents of every one of these magazines. And they published every 2 weeks, so there were a lot of them. But I could just, and it was between 1914 and 1930. I knew it was in there. So all I had to do is, just skim for education. I thought a magazine that was dedicated to labor unions and railway strikes and all kinds of stuff would only have a few articles in education in it, so it wouldn't be hard to find. But I spent like 7 hours, and then I finally just started using a portable scanner to scan the table of contents of each one of these things so I could try and find the relevant ones. And it turns out the progressives did more to education than they did to anything else, and yet they don't teach us that very much in school, if at all. They do call it progressive education, what goes on in the public schools, but they don't tell you how it was developed and why it was developed. So I read all this stuff, long story short. I read a lot of these articles by John Dewey and Dallas Lore and Charles Potter, just all of these articles. And it struck me they were trying to do something much bigger than get poor kids in education, which is what I've been told in school progressive education was about. What they were trying to do is seize control of a pretty fundamental power. And I wasn't exactly sure what they were doing, but it got dark, the library closed, they made me leave. So I was walking out the door on the 4th floor, I still remember of the Boise Library, and my eye caught the education sign. I looked back and the gal was not paying attention, so I could, sneak into the seat.
You might be a classical educator if.
Yes. Snuck down the aisle on education, and I started looking at all these books on the history of education. They were all written by government bureaucrats and NEA people and nothing. But there was this one, they call it American Education, and it had to be written by somebody with some scholarship because it was 3 volumes and it was huge. And one of them had a label on it. It was a Pulitzer Prize-winning book. So I checked the 3 out, not knowing what I'd find. And that's when we had that encounter where I'm reading along and he's going, they didn't do this for any, I used the quote in the book, I can't cite it exactly right now, but they didn't do it for the sake of a better educated populace or kids who could do it. They did it for the control of the nation politically. It was a political control move. Now, Kremen was a professor of education at Columbia University's Teachers College, which anybody who knows that college, it is the preeminent progressive center in the country. So he's certainly one of the insiders. And he was famous. I mean, you can find him on, like William F. Buckley interviewed him a bunch of times, that sort of thing. But he got blacklisted after he wrote this series and won the Pulitzer Prize because he revealed, I believe, I can't prove this, but I think he revealed the game plan. And it got buried in corners of libraries that nobody goes in. So I figured I'd just write a book about what somebody else figured out. It wasn't my scholarship.
It's funny how in an era in which, especially the last couple of years, we've seen a lot of conspiracy theories that turn out to be less conspiratorial and less theoretical and more factual. It's a strange time. This seems like a really long game. I mean, especially growing up under the influence, many of us in the public system. As I'm reading along in the book, as we've discussed it, how is it? It seems almost too fantastical to be that on the nose and that out in front of everybody. How do the progressives exert such influence over such a long span of time to get where they are today?
Good question, yeah. When we were working on the book, the editor wanted to call it a conspiracy theory, and Pete and I both pushed back. There's a few ingredients you have to have for a conspiracy. One is that you don't really want other people to know what you're doing, and they were publishing it in national publications for about 20 years, and they weren't hiding it. And they were saying things that were so stunning, like Potter's quote. Again, I'm bad at it. Do you have it? Is that this one? No.
Let's see, I got it. Go to the book.
Yeah. I'll wait till he finds it, Charles Potter. This one is like, okay. So I'll tell you who Charles Potter is while you're at it. So Dewey, in the 1930s, was called upon to write the Humanist Manifesto, which was the first of it. And so he penned it in conjunction with a couple other guys, but he also was a signator on it. He was an author because he was a member of the Humanist Society of New York. The president of the Humanist Society of New York is Charles Potter. So this is what do you have it there? Yeah, where does he say 6 days a week?
We're just going to sit up here and read the book while you're
Is that the one with the 6 days a week quote in it?
A couple of great things. First of all, he says, by freeing religion of supernaturalism, it will release tremendous reserves of hitherto thwarted power. Man has waited too long for God to do what man ought to do himself, and is fully capable of doing. Also, and this should strike a chord, the chief end of man is to improve himself, both as an individual and as a race. And you know the relationship to the Westminster Shorter Catechism. The chief end of man is to glorify God and to enjoy him forever. The views of the progressives, you say, and humanists of the first half of the 20th century are summed up in one of Potter's most telling statements. What can theistic Sunday school meeting for an hour once a week do to stem the tide of a 5-day program of humanistic teaching?
Yes, and he was working in concert with John Dewey, who is known well by almost everyone, the title, the father of modern American education. So it was one of those conspiracies that was so non-conspiracy-like. They just decided they were going to achieve it. They did it in public, and the only thing they had was the cover of obscurity, because nobody cared about education. There were anarchists throwing bombs at this time too. There were labor strikes. There were train stations being blown up in the name of labor. There were governors of states being blown up. This state, one of them. All of this was going on, and while that smoke was rising, the most significant work of the progressives was happening over in the corner, and it was about taking control of the country. And everybody thought it was just about a boring, pat them on the head. They're nice kids. We'll teach them how to turn cogs in some kind of machine somewhere. And that's the conspiracy in mid out in the open.
You alluded to this just a little bit ago. How is the church complicit in this? In perhaps the early days of latching onto some of the better sounding elements of progressivism, how did they get pulled into? How did we as a church, how did the churches get pulled into this in a way that affects us still today?
Yeah, that gets covered a little bit in one of the later ones, but essentially, Horace Mann, another character in this, in the 1820s, 30s, and 40s, created a public school system to replace the church school system. And the churches were, it was tax funded, so they were happy to let that happen. And these schools, these public schools, were very Christian. I mean, they memorized catechisms, they said the prayers. And by the late 1800s, this system had so overtaken, it was like anything else the government takes on. It usurps the church, and then the church forgets its role in education. So once the church was out of it, somebody said, saying the Apostles' Creed at the beginning of the day is not going to help our progressive agenda. Maybe we could try creating a pledge called the Bellamy Pledge that is precisely what the Pledge of Allegiance we know is without under God put into it. Because Francis Bellamy was a socialist Christian minister. So he was a social justice warrior of the 19th century. And their goal was take Christ out of the school system, take the catechisms out of the school system. So while they were doing this, the church sat by idly because the church had long forgotten that it had any role in education. It had been in the public domain for so long that the church just didn't even say anything about it. We talk about that, I think I cover it in the book. The evangelical church had been persuaded that its whole job was to win souls for Christ. So it was doing camp meetings and that kind of thing in the late 19th century. It had forgotten its role in a lot of areas, one of which, interestingly, was orphanages. And we owe our Catholic brethren a little bit for some of this, because the debate that went on where the plasticity of a child was mentioned was going on between a Catholic priest who was running orphanages in New York. And when the progressives took over regulation of those orphanages, he said, stay out of our orphanages. The state has no position helping to raise orphans. That's the job of the church. And of course, he lost the argument and the progressives took over. But there weren't any Protestants there. There weren't any evangelicals there saying, hey, don't. It says directly in the thing, the Protestant orphanages gave in readily. Why are you fighting it? That's what the progressive editorial board is saying to Father Blakely. I do a Substack called davidgoodwin.substack.com. And if you want to read the actual document from which this came, I published it a while back on there.
It sounds like when we think about Paideia, of course, you mentioned it has some roots. It is defined by the Greeks. It clearly takes on a new angle in the Christian era as the gospel spreads after the resurrection. And now, in our time, it seems to be separating out again. And you mentioned in the early 20th century, I guess this is a question, how much of what we've lost is due to disintegrating the great books, the great ideas, the great traditions from the truths of Scripture, or perhaps overemphasizing, as you mentioned, only one aspect of the faith or one aspect put another way, why isn't the Bible alone sufficient for a classical Christian education? Why the classical part?
Well, that's good. I think this goes to really less about the Greeks and Romans, less even about the early church, more about the medieval church. When the medieval church picked up classical Christian education, they formalized much of its structure. And what they were looking for wasn't a Sunday school where kids were taught Bible. That already existed in the form of parents teaching catechisms or priests teaching them in the local whatever. They were looking for cosmology, which is a $2 word for worldview. They wanted to cast every child to see the world in this I'll say hyper spiritualized, but I'm only saying that because that's how we would see it, because we've been dulled back during the Enlightenment and into materialism. So we tend, for example, you won't hear sermons dwell very long on the angels and demons in the New Testament, or the nature of the heavenly hosts, or any of the supernatural activities that go on. We talk about the miracles in the evangelical church, but most everything is kind of like blunted that had to do with supernatural stuff. And that's because of the Enlightenment. Well, in the medievals, they said if we can just discover the truth of the way the world works, it'll tell us something about who God is and how the whole universe, the cosmology of the universe works. And so that was when it really burst into being the educational form that we're trying to recover now, an educational form that looks and says, we're going to try and understand the truth of everything, not just the truth of the Bible. So that's why the Bible is the weather vane that shows you, or the truth factor that shows you what's true and what's false in all these other sources. And that there's truth in those other sources too, and the Bible can validate that truth, but it's said in a way that's helpful. So that's I don't know if I touched the question.
Well, I think, yes. One of the things I like about your historical approach here is we could look back to any era of our past. All of it started to go south in the 80s, clearly. Or the 60s, boy, those 60s, rough. Or the 19-teens. But you trace through the Enlightenment even some challenges that we would have if we simply went back to the Founding Fathers. Why can't we just go back to the Founding Fathers? What is the fatal flaw there that we're still even, as you mentioned, setting up the stage for the progressives?
Right. No, that's great, Bill. We live in meta-narratives. We live in these stories, right? We live with stories in our heads that have been told to us, and we just that's the narrative we know. So what's the narrative of the founding that we hear? Well, the narrative of the founding tends to be that we wanted freedom from King George, and we founded a republic based on the rights that were endowed by our Creator, and that was really Jesus, but they just didn't really use the word Jesus, but they meant Jesus. And then some of the founding fathers were all about Jesus, but they didn't ever use the name Jesus.
Like people who are all about Jesus.
Yeah. So that's the narrative, right? Well, I'll propose a different narrative. The narrative is you wind the clock back a few hundred years, and post-Reformation, you have wars between Catholics and Protestants across Europe, and people get fed up with it, and they're looking for a solution. So instead of trying to reconcile two very similar truth systems, what they do is invent a third called materialism, where they just say, pox on all your houses. We aren't going to side with the Catholics or the Protestants. We're going to say it doesn't matter because it's all made up. Because the only thing that's real is what's material, what we can feel and touch. Because you can argue about whether there's water in this or not, and we can scientifically test whether there's water in this or not. We cannot tell you whether that's holy water or not, right? That's an argument for religion. So in doing that, they condemned Christendom as a thing. And you see the first the first flags start to come out. This is where I use this in the book. You can kind of trace this loss, this narrative. Every flag in Europe prior to probably 1600, maybe 1700, was a Christian flag. Had a cross on it in some form, right? The Scottish flag's got the cross of St. Andrews. The cross of St. George is the English flag. The flag, in the early 1700s, you start seeing the flags of the German states that don't have a lot of that because, they're all a variety of small states. And then you see the French flag emerge. The original French flag, if you've ever seen it, what is it? It's a field of blue with 3 fleur-de-lunes on it that are the Trinity. That's the measure of it. So the French get rid of that in the Revolution and put the 3 colored stripes. And the American flag is the second one to cast off Christ, cast off any sense of allegiance to Christ, and put up meaningful stars and stripes. So the narrative, if you recast it that way, was the Enlightenment predated America by a long shot, and it was used to undermine Christ in culture, because the deists quickly came along and said, we need a God, because even the Greeks knew they needed a God. They just didn't know what he looked like. So we'll take a God. It just can't be Jesus Christ. And I think that's where the roads parted and the very first problems started.
I've been thinking about that question for about 10 years since the first time, or longer since we first talked about that. I think it's intriguing. But are you saying that there's no room for patriotism then? Should we not be encouraging a loyalty and a love of nation? Is that where we end up? Or does classical Christian education speak to that as well?
No, I'm a patriot. I consider myself one, in the sense that there were a minority of the framers, the founding fathers, guys like John Jay, Patrick Henry. These guys, they were the ones pushing back and saying, I don't know about all this endowed by our Creator stuff. What I do know is people are evil, and a constitutional republic with limited powers will provide the best opportunity to hold tyrants at bay. So it's the first government, the American government's the first one that recognized the true nature of people. And from that standpoint, I think it's the best option we've got. I just don't want to whitewash the part about Jesus being effectively removed from any reference to in that, and they added the parts in the show about George Washington. He did have some really good things to say that did involve Jesus Christ, but most of the founding fathers did not. They would not use. John Adams is probably one exception. But
so, shifting gears a little bit, and I want to open it up to the audience here in just a moment, give them plenty of time to ask you some questions. But I wonder, what do you think, considering we are products of our culture? One of the, Pete and you mentioned that politics is downstream of culture, but culture is downstream of religion, and you cite the Lincoln, attributed to Lincoln, the philosophy of the schoolroom in one generation becomes the philosophy of the government in the next generation, and we can't escape the tree that we find ourselves attached to. But here we are in this educational, reformational, or recovery work. The ACCS conference every year, Repairing the Ruins conference, we're trying to rebuild, rediscover. But what do you think are the biggest challenges that parents and schools like ours have in doing this work while we are in the very culture that has trained us both to not see it and to fight against it?
And what's more, Repairing the Ruins, incidentally, as I know you know, is a reference to repairing the ruins of our first parents. So it's really not about the ruins of education, it's about the ruins of sin. And it is doubly difficult when your culture is against you and you have a sin nature. I mean, but that's what makes it a high calling, is that God has called us to this work. I think all of us are called to the education of our children in such a way. I think working against the culture is the biggest problem we have, because the culture tells lies in narrative form. And as I told you before, that narrative form carries a lot more weight than what would be called didactic or rhetorical form, right? So if somebody tells you something that's untrue to your face in a blatant way, you can spot it. If you just are believing a narrative, for example, the narrative of homosexual nature, in identity, that narrative, even to the Roman world, which was much more debased even than our own in some respects with regard to sexuality and children and all of that, they wouldn't have seen it. That would be foreign to them. It's these insidious pieces that work their way into vocabulary, into language, into narratives, into the stories that we believe. We may think we're adequately protecting our children, but the only real way you can't block it out, because the narratives come through assumption and through just living in society. The only thing you can do is teach your kids to understand story and understand how to take apart a story and understand what's being done to you with that story. And that's what classical Christian education does.
I love that you said that one of the most compelling reasons that you got involved here is, and that even Fox picked it up, was because here we have a solution that's bigger than the problem. So how do you see, you've spent a couple decades now investing in classical Christian education, more than that. Why particularly is this such a powerful solution to that problem?
Well, it's powerful because it developed over 2,000 years, so it's got a lot of history and it's made a lot of mistakes and it's already fixed, so you take something that has a long human trajectory to it and it can be a very powerful tool. I think the reason it's bigger is different than being powerful. It's bigger because when Fox contacted me, and you still see this, they're concerned about indoctrination in the schools. And I told them that's not the problem. That is a problem. The problem is they're not training in the Western Christian paideia. Because with the Western Christian paideia, if you try and indoctrinate somebody, they ask questions. It gets very difficult to persuade, and that's exactly what Kremen says in his book, is why they wanted the Western Christian paideia out and what he calls the American paideia in, was because they wanted a controllable populace. Because you can move them wherever you want to move them once they're controllable. So the bigness of it is that classical Christian education creates an uncontrollable populace. And everybody out there right now is thinking, we just don't want our kids taught all this LGBT stuff because it's, all the Christians, this is sinful, we don't want it being taught. They're missing the fact that the much bigger opportunity is to train students who can actually change the culture, not just kick against the flags that fly on the top of the parapets.
Yeah, that's great. And if our students are loyal first and foremost to their Lord, to God Almighty, to Jesus Christ, then they are not only not controllable by any human institution, but much more than that, they're instruments in the hands of a good and sovereign and ultimately victorious God. That is good news. Well, I want to pitch it to our audience here. Excited to hear some of their questions. And Mr. Roberts, yes, thank you. Mr. Roberts is going to come with a microphone so you can ask your questions here. And so questions you have for Mr. Goodwin about all of these things we've been able to discuss tonight.
Thank you for coming. I have a question that I've puzzled over for a while. If we were to take a snapshot of the 20th century, of the totalitarian systems that grew out of the 20th century, the cohesiveness and the momentum of those systems were very individual and personality driven. There's qualifications to that, but Hitler and Lenin and Mao, and their success was relatively short-lived in the span of history. Much of what you're describing, and one of the things that I've puzzled over in the United States, is we see this new totalitarianism spreading sustained over a much longer period of time, maintaining a cohesiveness, maintaining a momentum, but it doesn't seem to have any personalities or charismatic individuals leading it. What's holding it together and what's driving it forward?
Paideia. That's an excellent question, but it's true. So here's the deal. The progressives knew that they had to undermine the Western Christian paideia because it trained children in a certain way of thought and with a certain set of affections. They knew they couldn't get rid of it overnight, and they knew that parents would revolt if you suddenly took all virtue out of classrooms. So they replaced it with the American virtues that we see. So it was the progressives who put the flags over all the schools and in front of the schools, and put the Bellamy salute with the kids. If you see the pictures, they're doing the kind of, it's the Roman salute, but it's the one that Nazis use, so it gets a lot of press. They did all this to try and detach from the Western Christian paideia. Once they'd done that, then they inserted what we call the cultural Marxist paideia. And what you're facing right now is that the name brand politicians, the AOCs, the Nancy Pelosi's, are actually being dragged along in many respects by the paideia, because the young people, it's a 40-year cycle. It's why I think the scripture refers to a generation being 40 years. It's about a 40-year cycle, and in the book I can trace it all the way back. You can see each generation. We're now in the generation, we're about 10 years into the generation that has a cultural Marxist paideia. So it's being dragged by something that's not human. It's contained in people, but it's really a set of affections that are powerful enough to scare politicians. And any old line Democrats that were in the party are chased out because there didn't have to be a Hitler telling people to tear down statues and burn the cities. It was all done by the youth that were this paideia was embedded in them. For example, that it's virtuous to destroy that which was unlawfully gained by the white colonialists, right? That's a virtue statement, and that's what they would say is what they're doing. That's a paideia. It's the way their affections are aligned. Good question.
So to sort of sum up the narrative a little bit, there was this powerful Western paideia that had educated generations for centuries and centuries. Since at least 500, 600, AD. And they go along, and all of a sudden you have this Protestant heresy of Marxism crop up, especially in the 18th and 19th centuries. And this slowly takes root, right? And it supplants the original paideia that had been guiding Western civilization. These are kind of like big cultural meta-narratives that we're following, but I'd like to sort of bring it down to earth a little. How, if the classical Christian Western paideia was really so powerful and so good and so strong that it educated a culture for a millennia or more, how did it get supplanted in 100 years, which in the grand scheme of things is actually a pretty small time? And how can we learn from how it was supplanted to take our vengeance, so to speak? And along those lines specifically, like education savings accounts, is that an opportunity where we can start to wield the power of the state in the right direction again? Or is that more abdication, like with the case of the Catholic orphanage?
Well, the undermining of it took phases. We talked about it earlier, the fact that the church abdicated education to the secular state was one one piece of it. Prior to that, and kind of during that, the use of the 7 liberal arts was was supplanted. It's really just a function of over 150 years negligence by the church and promises by the progressives. So the church gets out of the education business. The progressives promise an education to everyone, not just the elite. The church says they want social justice. The progressives grab hold of that, take Marxism, combine it in there, and create sort of this idea that that's what the function of the school is. You get the industrialization. We need to train children in doing things because they need to do things in a factory to have a job. It supplants again the church. So I think the story, the meta-narrative the only one I can point to is that the church kept failing to do that which was the church had historically done for thousands of years. It had always been the purveyors of classical education in different forms, in different ways. So sometimes it was just for the aristocrats, but they were the ones with the power, so it was good for them to have it. Late, when the Reformation came around, books for every kid. John Amos Comenius was a well-known educator in that time. They democratized education for everybody. So it took different forms, but it was always the Western Christian paideia. And those steps that I mentioned earlier and I just recapped, I think are, if we're going to look for a smoking gun, we're not going to find it. That's the nature of these sweeping social changes, is that they're done by long-term investments in changing the infrastructure for education that then results in a whole revolution from a point of view you could never see it coming. And I think that's where a lot of us are. It's like, we didn't see this coming in the last few years because it was such a slow burn. It takes 100 years to do it. So I'm not sure if that completely answered your question, but I don't think I can point to a smoking gun. It was a long series of events where the church continued. I mean, one of the problems I've cited often is that the church became the church of the camp meeting instead of the church of the town, where the whole focus was evangelism. There was no focus, or very little focus, on educating hospitals, orphanages, parish pastors who would care for the flock. That was not emphasized for 100 years. And when you neglect a garden, it dies. Oh, on ESAs? We're, as an association, we're always monitoring those things. They're dangerous because they get government somewhat involved, but sometimes there's no other alternative. We have to do things like that. So as far as ESAs, they give you funding for private education is essentially what they do. Are you talking about using an ESA to completely supplant the public schools funding model?
Well, I'm saying that there's a lot of conservatives who would say they're good at that. But then you have a lot of homeschooling families and classical Christian people who would say, no, just getting the state involved.
Yeah.
Which direction should it go?
Yeah, it is. And no, I don't have a good answer. Just because I'm very leery of touching anything government touches. It's because now isn't what it was 200 years ago. Now the government is openly hostile to us. Even whether Republican or Democrat, both of them want the state in charge of your kids. And that's, at least not all Republicans, but certainly the governor of this state just decided he was going to pay teachers exorbitant amounts of money in public schools, as though that's going to fix something. It's a mess. I can't speak, I really can't answer more on ESAs because it depends on the ESA and where it is and what it's doing and how it's constructed, but I do think they're dangerous.
I think the caution that you mentioned is that these things are hard to see right when they're right in front of you, so having some history and a bit of a long view is still important. Although, quick change is certainly a biblical precedent. I mean, we can see that faithfulness over many generations can be undone in a very short period of time. So just because something has lasted for a long time and was strong doesn't mean that God can't upend it, because he certainly humbles the proud.
One of the regular features or highlights on Fox News proper, let's say, are seemingly brave but perhaps more naive screeding parents at school board meetings who are then, let's say, lionized and put before millions of viewers as people who are really fighting the good fight, which seems to me to be cheering on someone trying to scoop out a sinking ship with a cup. And so now that your writing has been, let's say, coupled together with a more popular platform, do you have concerns that the increased growth that might go along with classical education being on a Fox Nation docuseries will potentially create growth that brings people who are on, let's say, outer concentric circles that see that there's a problem, but they don't really have the proper view that the people at the center, or who have the most niche view of classical Christian education, have, and they see and articulate the problem as it actually is? Do you have a fear that too rapid of growth will dilute down what has already been accomplished? Because on the one hand, you're recognizing that there is some amount of slow growth that has degenerated it, growth that you don't want, like a cancerous tumor. So is it, in some sense, possibly harmful to what has already been accomplished if you get too many coming in at the same time who might not have exactly the right finger on the pulse of the problem?
Yeah, so two questions that I would address there. One is the nature of Fox, and the other is the nature of growth, given what publicity is now coming out. So Pete will tell you, and I've experienced it personally being in the Fox studios a number of times, that there's multiple Foxes. I mean, it is essentially a big corporation with big corporation intentions. Funny, if you look at some of the things, we shot in some of these locations because of the mask mandates, and we were trying to sneak around Fox policies, not the policies, so like you'll see me interviewed on a number of occasions out front, in the front of their studio building, because I wasn't allowed inside the building because I'm not vaccinated. So then after that, I was in the building at different times, and so it's just like the thing is a big, what do they call it, a hot mess. They've got homosexuals on the station. I was there one time and there was a debate going on between two of the conservative commentators, but there is a Christian group at Fox. The weekend, for example, what do they call their Sunday or their morning show on the weekend? All three of them, the hosts are all pretty solid Christian, various sins in their past and what have you, but at the end of the day, don't look at this documentary or any part of it as an endorsement of Fox. They were people who funded it and they put it out, and I'm grateful for that. But Fox is a mess, and it's helpful. It's
to the living in this world.
Yes, which has been funny because we've gotten criticisms from some on doing it with Fox, and I'm going, well, I would have done it with NBC, but I doubt they would have been faithful to it. So the second part of your question was about rapid growth and danger. I am concerned about that. We're certainly investing as an association in our accreditation system to try and keep things that way. I will say that when people, you almost have to be called to classical education. So even if you read this book, we've sold over 300,000 of these things at this point. And I've talked to dozens of people who are doing something about it. Where'd the rest of them go? Right? There's a lot more people who should be interested in doing stuff than 100 new startup schools with 300,000 of these things. I think it's not too big of a risk because it's too hard to do and too hard to get next to unless you really want it. And people will quickly, when they count the cost, they will walk away. Your average parent who just doesn't like the fact that they're teaching LGBT stuff in their public school classroom isn't willing to make the sacrifice to come to a classical Christian school and pay the fees. So I think we're probably okay there. But I'm hoping we find more people. You know, we'll find Gideon's 300, and that's what we're looking for.
All right, I think Mr. Roberts is making his way around to.
I'm loud. I can just start.
We'll give you the mic. That way.
I don't sprint anymore. Apologize as I ramble through this. Sort of two parts. You guys have talked around the idea of the classical Christian paideia a little bit. There are a handful, I'm aware of, classical schools that are expressly not Christian, and even a certain liberal arts college that is starting some around the country that says that's what they're going to do. Is that an also-ran? Is that valuable, or is that missing the boat? Do we have to have classical Christian school, or is classical school okay? Does that get us part of the way? And then, sort of presuming where you're going to go with that, kind of drilling a little bit deeper. I certainly don't know all of the schools in your organization, but I'm aware of a handful. And the ones I know of, it seems the ones that are really serious about classical Christian education also have large proponents in those organizations that lean towards Reformed theology. Specifically, is that a coincidence? Or is there something about Reformed theology and classical Christian education that resonate and scaffold each other, whereas maybe another vein of Christianity doesn't lend itself as well to the idea that you're trying to get across with this paideia that we're building?
Yeah, so I'll answer the last question first. I think that because it was founded originally Moscow, you know, and it has ties to some Reformed theology, it had the most number of schools fit that bill, or at least they did. There's a Catholic organization that runs a Catholic classical called the ICLE. They have 250 members, and we're at 400, so they're not far behind us. There's a whole Lutheran organization. Now, I was one of those people who used to think that Lutheran meant Reformed, but they debate that. So I'll let the Lutherans self-define themselves as non-Reformed. But they have a very good showing in classical Christian education. Some of our best schools are in the Lutheran system. They sometimes are joint members, so I say ours because we don't have Catholic members, but we can have Lutheran members. So I think it depends on, I think it grows in rich soil, and I think that all of those places where you got a deep historical tradition of liturgical Christianity tend to grow classical schools for some reason. So that's the answer to that part of the question. What was this first part?
Not secular classical.
Oh yeah, secular. That's pragmatism. I've talked to the provost at Hillsdale. I don't mind using the name because they're out and about doing their thing. Hillsdale has a different narrative. Their narrative is that classical education was part of the American education system, public education system, and so they seek public funds, and that's the way they're going to promote it. I would say, okay, that's the mistake. That if America was ever trying to be classical and not Christian, then that's where the mistake was made. So I think it's compromised. It's really hard to do classical education. Again, what is paideia? It's the cultivation of affections of children to things that are true, good, and beautiful. What's true, good, and beautiful? Well, the only way you can answer that question without going crazy, which is what the sophists of ancient Greece did, is Jesus Christ. That's truth, goodness, and beauty can only be understood in Jesus Christ. So you can take Jesus Christ out of your classical school and you can get close to what the Greeks had, and you may get close to what the result, which was very confused people.
If I may ask, have you received a lot of pushback or attempts to suppress the book?
Excellent question. No. If you look on Amazon, I haven't looked for months, but we had one of the highest review ratings. We got 10,000 reviews, 7,000, I don't remember how many it is.
Did you manage to get canceled?
We didn't get, it's education. What did I say? Nobody cares. See our opportunity? No, it's a great question because it's funny. We keep thinking somebody's going to come after us eventually. Pete gets canceled all the time, so I thought maybe I'd get a chance, but alas.
The century is young.
Yes, it is. And if this starts getting legs and changing things, people might actually be in 100 years looking at this and going, see, those Christians told us what they were going to do.
Yeah, they telegraphed it.
Yeah.
Before this next question, though, I mean, that does make me wonder, are you seeing schools that are facing opposition? Maybe education isn't so much, but are you starting to see member schools that are having to fight battles that they didn't have to fight before?
I think so, mostly in the DEI end of things. There's confusion over what is Christian and what isn't with regard to social justice, or is there even such a thing as Christian social justice? Hint, no. There's justice, and it's God's justice. There's no social justice. But Christians still grab hold of that and end up in messes, and so we've got a little bit of that going on, less than some places, less than the mainstream evangelical Christian schools do.
Wow. David Hicks, in his book Norms and Nobility, says that, if I can remember correctly, that the logic of democracy demands that every student be educated as an aristocrat, which would seem to match with the way that liberal arts education was done in the Greco-Roman times, and even in the medieval times to a large extent, that you had to have an aristocrat's funding to afford an education. But for the Greeks, of course, it went even further, right? Aristotle believed that some people were slavish by nature and ought to be treated as slaves. So David Hicks expanding that, right, to, like he says, the logic of democracy, and set aside the quibbles over exactly, America's not exactly a democracy, but considering that idea, right, that to hold even a democratic, small d democratic form of government needs a whole nation full of aristocrats, as it were. One, is that what we're doing here at these schools, is educating a whole nation of rulers? And two, maybe it's the same question, is that realistic? Is that possible to do? Are all people by nature capable of being aristocratic in their demeanor, in their personage, in their behavior?
Yeah, I think that's the nature of Paideia. Yes, all are capable. Do we have the institutions in place to make it happen on the scale that it did in the 19th century, in which case there was a Christian Paideia, a Western Christian Paideia still in place? Now, was it a perfect one? There's never been a perfect Western Christian Paideia. It's always had flaws in any instantiation, but if you just looked at the principles of it, the 19th century student was widely in America educated in a Christian Paideia. That's what the New England Primer and those sorts of things. It's why when you look at something like the Civil War, you have a civil war fought not over the historical view. Every civil war is about the power of one tribe against the power of another, right? For land or for money or for power. That's always what civil wars are for. This one wasn't. This was a war over justice, and there's debates about that, but essentially the arc of it is it was a war about principles. It could only happen in a nation where people were willing to die for principles, which can only happen in a nation that has a Christian Paideia, or a Western Christian Paideia. So do we have to convert everybody to Western Christian paideia? The beauty of an aristocrat is they aren't defined, despite what we're told in our history books, solely by their birth. They're defined by their educations in a great measure. So who will be the powerful and the good and the wise in the future? If we educate just 300,000, that's the number we've been kicking around, 300,000 in this country, classically, and some number it's not going to take, right? And some are going to go, there's always been devils made of, clever devils made from classical education. But if we just get a fraction of those people to act and be like aristocrats, even if they don't have the title, they'll assume the position in culture. They will begin to be cultural leaders. It's really the interesting thing about it. What is the height of the trivium? Rhetoric. What does rhetoric help you do? Persuade. Who are the most persuasible people? Slaves. If we have a whole bunch of publicly educated kids who just go wherever the good arguments are, if the persuasive arguments, not even the good ones, and we're the only ones with the persuasive capacity, that could be a good thing. That's hopeful. It's not necessarily, yeah. And David Hicks also said we were lost a few years ago. And I took so much from his book that I had to write him and say, come on.
Well, do you have any, David, last words of encouragement for our families? You begin to allude to the word that comes to mind is faithfulness. How can we be faithful in our work right now? How can we play the long game? What do you want parents in your schools walking away thinking and hoping, and how do you want them to act as they go forward in faithfulness?
As we got near the end of the writing project, we hadn't finished the book yet, and we had to finish it somehow. And Pete was worried that it was going to send a bunch of people off bridges somewhere, because it's like, if this is true, we're all in trouble. And I talked about faithfulness to what God is in control. We're just called to be faithful. And Pete thought for a second, and he said, let's try insurgency. Because Pete was a military guy, and he was a counterinsurgency expert in Afghanistan. And what he saw was basically the faithfulness of the Muslims to just wait it out and continue to cultivate their evil, in that case, within the communities that they were in, so that as soon as the Americans vacated, they returned to power, right? All it took was weakness for a moment. And so that's why the book ends with a call to an insurgency. And when we call it an insurgency, we're not meaning that we want a physical fight. We mean every one of you sitting in the seats who has a kid in classical Christian schools making sacrifices, and they're, just like an insurgent would face, right? Just like Wang Yi in China, put in prison, having your money taken away from you, those sorts of things. Slow, methodical commitment to the principles. That's why we wrote the book full of the principles behind classical Christian education, is to say, this is the future, but it's a long way out. And all you can do right now is the next good thing, and the next good thing. And so that's what I'd encourage you is, it's hard. I've got one kid with one more year left in classical Christian school. The bills, the homework, the failures, the trips to the office, we won't talk about that. It's all worth it, but not in this immediate term.
You're shaping character for the future, for the long haul.
The culture of a people. And I'm not talking about the American people. It's the Christian church that needs to restore a Christian culture. And once the church has a Christian culture, we really don't need the secular world to come along with us. Amen. They'll want to.
Amen. Well, we say often in convocation here at CCA, we ask, why are you working so hard? And you might know the answer. To become fit rulers someday. I think Matt Whitling
I don't know, Bill. I see your fingerprints all across the association on your clever sayings. I appreciate that.
Well, what we're talking about is faithful ruling in whatever sphere that God gives our children. Whether that is heads of state, heads of the home, heads of the neighborhood association, or just the dinner table, being faithful.
Head of the church.
Head of the church. Fit ruler someday. And this goal of freedom, I think maybe closing with this, you allude to this, that the goal of Paideia, the Western Christian Paideia, is freedom. And I think of Paul's exhortation in Galatians. It is for freedom that Christ has set us free. It's a different kind of freedom. And that's the freedom that we're aiming for. C.S. Lewis, you quote in your book, I feel like we would be remiss if we didn't
We
quote this.
almost
I know, but
got-
that's close.
We almost finished without it.
We were almost disqualified. You would have probably come before some sort of board. You didn't quote this, but you do in your book. And it's one of my favorites. Education is essentially for free men and vocational training for slaves. If education is beaten by training, civilization dies. So may you continue to be prospered in your work. We're thankful for the work that you do for our school, for our schools, for the Association of Classical Christian Schools. Thanks for being willing to fight the fight. I know it's not always an easy one, and it comes at a great cost, and your families certainly blessed us too by their support of you. And we're grateful for your friendship and your hard work. So thank you for joining us this evening, and I hope you'll stick around. We've got some refreshments, and we want some conversation. You can come meet David, and again, thank you for coming tonight. Thank you, David, for joining us. And
Thank you.
Godspeed. Since you're here, let's stand up and let's sing the doxology. A fitting, and you don't have to do this. I just don't want to miss an opportunity. Praise God from whom all blessings flow. Praise Him, all creatures here below. Praise Him above the heavenly hosts. Praise Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. Amen. God bless you all. Thank you, David. Thank you, Sean. Thank you. Thanks for your help.